so that one won't die. The Squirrel Club was legitimate and kind of serious. On the first day of 9th grade English, I assigned you a poem. Perhaps you remember. It was Albert Goldbarth's poem, Beaming Teenage, about both his time as an English professor and his time as the editor of his high school literary journal. I loved and still do love this poem, not because it is more beautiful than others, but because for you, on the first day of 9th grade, it seemed the most true. The speaker of the poem is teaching his class about cliché, and to illustrate the term, he quotes a laughable poem by his old high school classmate, Nancy Becker, a poem written on lavender paper in lavender ink, submitted to Reflections, his high school literary journal, that begins with the biggest cliché of all, time is like. But he has stopped there, for what must have only been a second of real time, but a lifetime within a poem. Outside of the classroom door, he sees his colleague and friend pass by, wasting away from lymphoma. This sight, Goldbarth writes, undoes the metaphorical lock of this literal moment, and it all floods over the banks of realization. He reflects on his friend's 17-year marriage ending, and he remembers a newspaper photo of a beaming teenage boy found recently in the river dead. But he also reflects on his nephew, who seemed just yesterday to be a precocious 5-year-old, and who is now a backpacking adventurer of the world. I have composure in front of my class, Goldbarth writes, but I'm also on my knees inside my brain and asking Nancy Becker for forgiveness. A poem which seemed at first to lack perspective, depth, and maturity now becomes for him startlingly true, perhaps only in the way age can illuminate. Yes, Nancy Becker was so exact and generous in reminding us time is like a river flowing. Now I must ask myself why I thought this poem was so appropriate for the first day of 9th grade English. Did I think you were Nancy Becker? Some of you did dot your eyes with hearts. Did I think you needed to treat the Nancy Beckers of the world with more empathy? And perhaps I thought you were all beaming teenagers, and that was connection enough. I wonder now if I was, as Goldbarth, on my knees inside my brain, asking you all for forgiveness. When would my intellectual elitism, a product only of age, I have simply been learning for longer than you, turn me against some of the greater truths that you all would present over these 4 years? I'm not suggesting you were always right. Sometimes you were clearly wrong. Sometimes I was also wrong. I think on your first day of Langlet, I knew even then I would not always look beyond the lavender ink and lavender paper. In some sense, that poem was preparing you to forgive me someday in the future, which is, I guess, today. You were right. Time is, in fact, like a river flowing. When I was a teenager, I used to long for the ability to stop time. I would make Faustian bargains, which usually meant I would give everything in order to avoid soccer practice, a stressful presentation at school, or the first day working as a waitress. Instead, I wanted to drive my 1992 Honda Accord off into the sunset forever. This would limit the amount of stress and anxiety, but it would also limit what I could accomplish in life. And in these moments, this was a trade I was willing to make. I'm glad no one took me up on it. In Annie Dillard's Teaching a Stone to Talk, she writes about a similar childhood existential crisis when realizing that she would not, in fact, marry her first love, Walter Milligan. This realization calls into question every aspect of how she had come to understand her life as a young person. Dillard wondered, if all these passions of mine be overturned, then what will become of me? Then what am I now? Despite how real Dillard felt at that moment, she had to reckon with the likelihood that, as she writes, she was a short-lived phenomenon, a fierce, vanishing thing like a hard shower, or a transitional form like a tadpole or winter bud. Not the thing in itself, but a running start on the thing. If what defined her in that moment would eventually cease to define her, then who was she? As a child, Dillard's solution to this was simply to never change. That is, to vow to love Walter Milligan, to hate her sister, and to run in the woods until she died. But the very presence of her book, though, calls this childhood promise into question. Foremost in her vow was this, Dillard writes, that she would remember the vow itself. Dillard's fear was a real one, and perhaps it is one that you feel today, more than ever. On these kinds of days when one thing ends and another begins, we are often asked to feel changed in some way. When you turned 13, you were most likely asked, how does it feel to be a teenager? When you began 9th grade, how does it feel to be in high school? And now, how does it feel to be an adult? Of course, in some way you feel exactly as you did before. And yet, as Dillard knows, Each moment we are alive, we are always a transitional form. We are always becoming. Even now, as you graduate, you might feel you are tricking yourself into a total transformation. When will you solidify into you? Or, as Dillard asks, what are you now? At some point in your schooling, a science teacher most likely shocked you with the reality of the human skeleton. Our bones are entirely refreshed every decade. In a similar sense, author Maggie Nelson is reminded of the ship Argo of Greek mythology, which, despite the renewal of its parts over the course of its long journey, was still the same ship. She likens the Argo to love, in that whenever someone utters the phrase, "I love you," its meaning must be renewed by each use. In some ways, this could be like Dillard's vow to remember the vow. We know we will change, but in each moment, we must renew our own distinct meaning. We vow to notice. One of my great fears that I have for you is that this will be the best day of your life. Conversely, I should say it is my hope that as you age, your life continues to unfold in beautiful and complicated ways. Paradoxically, as your teacher, I do not want high school to be as good as it gets. I think often of Tom Buchanan from The Great Gatsby, who narrator Nick Carraway says is one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything after savors of anticlimax. While virtually nothing about Buchanan's life parallels yours, he's a social Darwinist, a misogynist, and an all-around jerk. Much of Buchanan's success, both academic and athletic at Yale, is the kind of success we would hope for in our graduates. Does everything afterward, though, savor of anticlimax? As teachers, we feel tension between the need to make life great now and the need to prepare you for a great life later. Sometimes these seem at odds. I keep a small note on my desk, one that both affirms the potential of individual moments in time and also confirms the reality of change. On the last day of finals last year, a stack of books sat on my desk. They were my favorites I had passed along to Audrey Lupton to read while she was unable to join us in AP Lang that semester. Art as Experienced by John Dewey and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, among others. Hi, Miss Northenscold. Thank you for letting me borrow these books, she wrote in her trademark scrawl. Have a great summer. See you next year, Audrey Lupton. Each time I see this note, I am on my knees begging Nancy Becker and Audrey Lupton and every ninth grade student I've ever taught for forgiveness. How could I ever forget that we are always transitional forms, that we are winter buds and tadpoles? Even as our bones regenerate every decade, we are moments coming into existence. But like Maggie Nelson's analogy to the mythological ship Argo, you are at each moment distinctly and importantly you.